Are you eating in a way that humans have evolved to eat? Here are the 9 principles of an ancestral diet. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lucy from GutsyGreen.com. I am just your friendly neighborhood functional nutritional therapy practitioner, and I help adventurers to reclaim their what-if mentalities by naturally autopiloting their immune systems. In today's video, I'm going to share the 9 principles of ancestral diets. Now, before we jump into those, let's first talk about an old white man, a nutrition pioneer from the 1930s. No discussion about ancestral diets can omit Weston A Price. What a looker. In the 1930s, good old Wes traveled all around the world studying different populations who were adhering to an ancestral diet template. He also compared those people with people who were eating more modern frankenfoods. Wes here was actually a dentist, and he began to tie all of the populations who were eating more sugary, processed foods to tooth decay and health problems. What's more, he found that virtually all of the populations who were adhering to their more ancestral foods were free of all modern disease. Coincidence? I think not. So with that being said, he went to a lot of different places. He went up to the Arctic, hung out at the equator, went down to the southern hemisphere, all around. Globetrotter of his day. The diets that he identified as ancestral were incredibly diverse, but in all of his travels, he was unable to find, to his grave disappointment, a healthy population adhering to a vegan diet. So that's a point that I really want to drive home. There was no such thing as a vegan ancestral diet with people who are actually healthy. I'm sorry. But some people only ate things like insects or shellfish. So depending on how squeamish you are about animal products, there's probably a way to make it workable for you. So despite the vast diversity of all of the different diets that he uncovered, there were 9 common principles that were embodied in all of these diets. So let's go over those now. Numero uno, there were no refined or denatured foods. Guys, this is pretty much synonymous with something like no processed food. But basically, when we think about the processing that grains have to go through now before they make it to our kitchen cabinets, they undergo bleaching, grinding, filtering, and many of them are adulterated with additives and preservatives. So none of the foods that good old Wes identified that the ancestral populations were eating included any kind of refined flours. The second principle, as I intimated previously, Dr. Price was incredibly disappointed that he could not identify a vegan culture. Every single ancestral diet that he came upon included some kind of animal product. And, caveat, some of those animal products were actually consumed raw. Now, when I say that, you may get a little bit squeamish, but actually raw animal products are incredibly beneficial. They have an array of unique enzymes. Their nutrients don't become denatured through cooking. Often heat will actually lower the nutrition in our food, so a lot of the advocates of a raw plant diet would do well to remember that those principles can actually be applied to animal products as well. Now, for some cultures, these animal products were just things like grass-fed butter. A lot of cultures would follow around a herd of animals and eat the dairy products that they produced. So it wasn't all necessarily meat-based. Many cultures, of course, relied primarily on the sea and ate mineral-rich, anti-inflammatory, omega-3 containing seafood all the livelong day. And some cultures pretty much just ate bugs. The third principle is that ancestral diets were 4 times higher in calcium and minerals than current standard American diets. They were also 10 times higher in fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so this principle sort of goes along with one of the additional principles, which is that as a percentage of calories, fat composed between 30% and 80% of the calories that they consumed. That is way more than most of us consume. Our American society is pretty fat phobic. Now, to add on to that, only 4% of this fat was polyunsaturated fat, which refers to the vast majority of fat calories that we as Americans consume via industrial seed oils like soybean oil, canola oil, peanut oil, you name it oil. It's polyunsaturated fat. 96% of the fat calories that they were consuming were from saturated fat, thank you butter, and monounsaturated fat. Think lard, avocados, probably some extra virgin olive oil. So to kind of return to the previous principle, ancestral diets were way more nutrient dense. 4 times more minerals, 10 times more fat-soluble vitamins. And that was by and large because they were eating way more fat and way more high-quality fat. There are so many health implications for failing to consume enough of these nutrients. If you're still feeling pretty fat phobic, this is a great argument for getting over that, because we can't get these 4 important fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, which are integral for immune health, any other way than by consuming fat. Next principle, ancestral diets used every single part of the animal. They truly exhibited nose to tail eating. So many of their foods incorporated bones in some way, usually through the healing powers of bone broth. They also viewed organ meat as delicacies. They were highly, highly sought after. And that's pretty congruous with how they stack up nutritionally. Organ meats are some of the most nutritionally dense foods that we have on record. Beyond bones and organ meats, ancestral populations also consumed a lot of cartilage, and cartilage contains lots of the building blocks that we need for the vast majority of our tissue. Our tissue is made of a lot of cartilage, so that's pretty helpful. A lot of people get squeamish when they hear about this principle, but let me take a moment to reassure you. There are ways to disguise strange textures and strange tastes if you're not a fan, and I will link below to some suggestions for doing just that, so check that out. Principle number 6. Ancestral diets included many foods with high enzyme content. So when we think about the standard American diet, a lot of us are eating what we term dead food. And again, people who are familiar with the raw plant food movement should be familiar with this concept. So when we eat raw fruits and vegetables or raw animal products, likewise, if we ferment vegetables, it'll often increase their enzyme activity. So when we consume these foods, the enzymes present in them actually assist our body in digesting that food. So typically we'll rely on our pancreas to release digestive enzymes when we eat. But evolutionarily speaking, we would have already consumed the vast majority of enzymes that we required to digest the food in the food itself. So as you can imagine, if we stop doing this, the burden falls onto our pancreas, and our pancreas can become exhausted. So it's always a great idea to make sure that you're consuming at least some raw fruits or vegetables or something that is fermented every single day, and ideally with every single meal. Principle number 7 has to do with our beloved seeds, grains, legumes, and nuts. I know you love that stuff. I love that stuff too. But in ancestral populations, they never touched that shiz without soaking it first and then sprouting it. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, when you soak those things, you get rid of potentially problematic compounds that are found on the outside in the casings of seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes. Basically, these chemicals are how the plant is defending itself from creatures like you eating it. Believe it or not, the plant doesn't want you to eat its seeds because then it can't reproduce. So as a defense mechanism, it puts chemicals into its holes that are what we term immunostimulating. So in other words, if we consume large amounts of these chemicals, which we often do if we're shoving fistfuls of nuts into our mouth for snacks, which I do, then the concentration of those chemicals can actually elicit an inflammatory response and create health consequences. So by soaking those items first before we consume them, we're actually making them safe for us to eat. Now, sprouting these foods actually increases the nutrition available that we can glean from them, and also works to reduce these harmful chemicals that we just talked about. Finally, any breads made from these foods would have been naturally leavened. Think sourdough starter. Essentially what this does is it relies on the bacteria, yeast, and microbes from your environment to pre-digest those things for you, and in doing so, making the dough nice and fluffy. This is in contrast to baker's yeast, which artificially rises the dough without doing any of this pre-digestion. This further burdens our bodies to have to digest all of those proteins. And when we're talking about things like gluten, those proteins are huge, which is one of the reasons why gluten is such a common food sensitivity. Little tip, if you've discovered a gluten sensitivity and you have not tried old school, long fermented sourdough bread with potentially a lower gluten grain, like something like spelt or rye, you should do a very controlled experiment just to see if your body can tolerate it. Principle number 8 brings it back to fat. Have you heard of the term omega-3? Well, have you also heard of the term omega-6? There are honestly a fulfillion omegas, but these two are super important. So omega-3 is one of the most researched anti-inflammatory substances available to us in our food. It's a kind of fatty acid most commonly found in fatty fish. There are incomplete omega-3 fatty acids found in things like flaxseed, but our body has to take an extra step in order to make that plant omega-3 form available to us to use. Whereas when we consume omega-3 fatty acids from animal products, such as in wild-caught salmon, that omega-3 is immediately available for us to use. It doesn't have to go through any processing. This is compared to omega-6, which is super prevalent in the plant world. To be clear, our bodies need omega-6, but actually we get way too much of it in the standard American diet. So what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about omega-3 versus omega-6 is the ratio between the two in terms of the foods that we're consuming every day. So in ancestral diets, this ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 was 1-to-1. They were completely even in most cultures. That's in contrast to our standard American diet ratio, which is typically somewhere around 6-to-1, with omega-6 being the much more prevalent form of fatty acid that we consume. So a great way to mitigate this is to 1, remove industrial seed oils from your diet, 2, increase the prevalence of omega-3 fatty acids by regularly ingesting high-quality wild-caught seafood. And also investing in animal protein from pastured animals, which has been shown to have a much higher proportion of omega-3 fatty acids. Finally, that brings us to our last principle. Ancestral people friggin' binged on raw, unrefined salts. Does that sound maybe a little bit contradictory to some of the conventional advice that you may have gotten from doctors? Yeah, You may have heard from your doctor that ingesting too much salt can result in hypertension, but actually this is a fallacy and it's not backed up by literature. Really, what we need to consider for the development of hypertension is the balance between potassium and sodium. So when we get too low on potassium and too high in sodium, then we're dealing with hypertension. However, the literature has shown that cutting out sodium is not an effective way to right this balance. Really, we need to focus on augmenting potassium. So most people with hypertension need to work on augmenting their potassium, likely through just ingesting more produce. So if you're having 1 serving of produce with every meal of the day, there's pretty much no way that you can be low on potassium. So with that being said, raw, unrefined sea salt is so full of minerals. It serves as a potent antimicrobial, a great digestive stimulant, and it's friggin' delicious. So what do you think? If you look at your diet, are you following the principles of an ancestral diet? I love looking at this work because when you look at nutritional studies done in scientific journals, those studies are all fundamentally flawed simply because we don't have a long enough time period, we don't really have use of controls, and not to be a cynic, but people often lie to try to seem more healthy. So when we look at these ancestral diets and these commonalities that have emerged across the globe, it's sort of like the best long-term nutritional study available to us. After all, those people have been eating that way for millennia. So if you'd like a little bit more help on how to choose foods that embody these principles, I have linked my cheat sheet down below on all of the foods that I suggest going for and saying no to for your gut. It's everything in one easy place. So check below in the description box if you're interested in checking that out. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked the video, go ahead and like and hit subscribe below. It really helps and supports my channel. As always, I would love to hear from you in the comments. I wish you luck in your food choices, and I'll see you next time.